They called my daughter's treehouse a danger, a violation, something that didn't belong. But what they didn't know, what they never expected, was that one small act of kindness could rally an entire community. They wanted silence. Instead, they sparked a movement, and I wasn't about to back down. When my daughter rang the victory bell at the hospital, I made her a promise that we'd build something to celebrate her strength, her spirit, and everything she fought through. So together we built a treehouse. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. A little wooden sanctuary nestled in the backyard, filled with laughter, drawings, and dreams. To us, it was more than just a playhouse. It was a monument to survival, but the HOA didn't see it that way. A week after we painted the final board, I got the letter. Remove the structure immediately or face daily fines. No warning, no compassion, just cold, bureaucratic ink on paper. I called. I explained. I begged them to understand what it meant to us, but all they saw was a violation of code. That's when something in me shifted. I wasn't about to let them erase my daughter's story. If they wanted a battle over a treehouse, they were about to find out exactly who they were dealing with. The first fine came 2 days after I refused to take the treehouse down. $250, printed neatly on a notice taped to my front door, like it was some kind of invitation. I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely no one in their right mind would punish a father for building a treehouse with his daughter, especially not after everything she had been through. But the next day another fine arrived, then another, every morning without fail like clockwork. They weren't just enforcing a rule, they were waging a campaign. By the end of the first week, the fines totaled more than my monthly mortgage. That's when the real games began. One morning I caught a man crouching in the corner of my yard with a clipboard. No knock, no permission, just walking through my property like it belonged to him. He was measuring the treehouse, mumbling something about structural setbacks and sightline violations. My daughter was inside at the time, coloring on the floorboards we'd painted together. She looked out the window and asked, "Daddy, why is that man measuring our happy place?" I didn't have an answer. Then came the letters. More formal now, more aggressive. They cited codes I had never heard of, paragraphs pulled from decades-old bylaws, all twisted and stretched just enough to justify their crusade. The language was cold, calculated. Unsafe elevation. Unauthorized structure. Non-compliant with visual standards. All of it signed by the same name. Karen Whitmore, HOA president. Karen wasn't subtle. At the next HOA meeting, one I hadn't planned to attend until a neighbor tipped me off, she stood in front of the room and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "We can't just let people build whatever they want. We'll make an example of him." An example. She didn't care that it was a treehouse built by a cancer survivor and her father. She didn't care that it had become a quiet source of joy, not just for my daughter, but for the other neighborhood kids who came over to play. Karen wanted control, and when she couldn't get it through conversation, she reached for intimidation. It didn't stop there. My mailbox was flooded with complaints, most of them anonymous. The treehouse is an eyesore. It lowers property value. Too loud. One even accused us of drawing in the wrong kind of attention, whatever that meant. I started seeing cars slow roll past my home at night. Once I caught someone taking photos through the slats in our fence. They sped off before I could reach them. But the worst part, the part that made my blood boil, was when one of Karen's board members, a man named Bill, actually told my daughter she couldn't play outside. She was on the swing tied to the tree beside the house, not even near the treehouse that day. Bill walked up to the fence and said, "You're not allowed up there anymore, sweetheart. It's not safe. Your dad should have followed the rules." She came running inside, confused and afraid. Her smile was gone. I was done being polite. Karen had made her point. This wasn't about safety or codes or even the treehouse. This was about control. This was about reminding everyone who really ran the neighborhood. And she thought she could shame us into submission, bury us under fines and fear. But there was one thing she didn't know. That treehouse, it wasn't just some weekend project. It was a promise. A promise I made to a little girl who had faced something bigger and darker than anything Karen Whitmore would ever understand. A girl who had stared down chemo and surgeries and pain most adults couldn't handle. and still smiled through it all. That treehouse was a reminder that even after the hardest days, joy could grow again. And while Karen was busy waging her little war with clipboards and bylaws, someone else was watching. Because when you build something for the right reasons, when you fight not for revenge but for love, people notice. The neighbors who once stayed quiet started whispering. Parents who'd walked past with a disapproving glance now offered quiet support. One even slipped me a note. Don't give up. My son had leukemia, I get it. Karen had power. But I had something stronger. I had truth. I had purpose. And soon I'd have something else. Something she'd never see coming. The moment I stopped being afraid of the HOA was the moment they started making mistakes. I didn't plan to go public. Honestly, I just wanted to be left alone, to let my daughter enjoy the little world we built together without constant threats from people who saw rules as more important than reasons. But after that day, after they told my little girl she couldn't swing in her own backyard, I realized silence was no longer an option. So I wrote a post. I told the story from the beginning, not with anger, not with bitterness, just the truth. I shared how the treehouse came to life plank by plank, after every hospital visit, after every moment we weren't sure she'd make it. I wrote about the letter from the HOA, about the fines, the trespassing, the harassment, and I ended it with a simple line. They want to tear it down. But to her, it's not a treehouse. It's hope with a ladder. I hit post and closed my laptop, not expecting much. Maybe a few supportive comments. Maybe a handful of people who would understand what that place meant to us. But what happened next? I couldn't have imagined if I tried. By the next morning, the post had exploded. Thousands of shares, tens of thousands of comments. People from across the country were tagging their friends, their local news stations, even national outlets. Parents, survivors, doctors, nurses, strangers who'd never met us, but who understood something sacred had been threatened. My inbox filled up with messages, some crying, some furious, all saying the same thing. We've got your back. Then came the email, from a name I recognized immediately. One of the largest children's cancer charities in the country. They'd seen the post and wanted to help. At first, I didn't understand what that meant. I thought maybe they were offering support, or a statement, or legal aid. But then they asked, what if we turned your treehouse into something even bigger? 48 hours later, the trucks started pulling up. Not bulldozers, not HOA enforcers, news vans, local anchors, photographers, volunteers in matching shirts. The charity had organized a full-scale fundraiser. They called it Climb for Courage. The idea was simple. Kids, survivors, families, and donors would come to our backyard, take turns climbing into the treehouse, and write messages of hope on the walls. Every message raised money for pediatric cancer treatment. Every footstep on that ladder became a donation, and people came. Hundreds of them. Children still fighting, teens in remission, parents carrying framed photos of those they'd lost. Our yard overflowed with love, with laughter, with purpose. What had once been a quiet corner of our property became the heartbeat of a cause much bigger than us. My daughter stood in the treehouse window, looking out at the crowd. Her eyes wide, her smile bigger than I'd seen in months. "Daddy," she whispered, "they came for the happy place." Karen didn't say much at first, but I knew she saw it. The HOA board members were there, hiding in the back, watching as media crews interviewed me on the front lawn. Cameras rolled as kids painted hearts and rainbows on the treehouse walls. The same unauthorized structure she'd tried so hard to erase was now on every news station in the state. And not for breaking rules, but for breaking hearts wide open. What had been a code violation in her eyes became a symbol of resistance in everyone else's. A story of healing, community, and defiance against cold bureaucracy. Karen's email stopped. The notices disappeared. Not because she suddenly had a change of heart, but because there was nowhere left to hide. Her name had gone from a signature on a fine to the subject of op-eds and viral videos. Every time she tried to defend her actions, it only made things worse. People weren't interested in HOA rules anymore. They were interested in the little girl who'd survived cancer and built a treehouse with her dad. And now that treehouse was untouchable. The shift was undeniable. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact started stopping by. One man who'd lived 3 doors down for 10 years without ever saying hello dropped off cupcakes and said, "We're proud of you." Local businesses offered donations. Schools brought field trips. The fundraiser kept growing, and so did our story. That's the thing about power. When you use it to hurt people, it only lasts as long as no one's watching. But when people see the truth, when they rally behind something good, it becomes unstoppable. Karen wanted to tear something down. Instead, she built a movement. And I had a feeling this was just the beginning. The pressure had been building for weeks. Every interview, every fundraiser, every child's name written on the wall of that treehouse, it all led to one inevitable outcome. The story had grown too big for the HOA to ignore, too loud for them to silence. The board tried to retreat into policy, issuing vague statements about community standards and safety concerns, but no one was buying it anymore, especially not the neighborhood. It turns out people pay attention when a story hits them in the heart, and this one had reached everyone. Parents, homeowners, teachers, church groups, even former HOA board members started calling for change. The same neighbors who used to wave politely from a distance now stood shoulder to shoulder on our lawn, holding signs that read, "Let kids be kids," and "This treehouse stands." It was no longer about me or my daughter. It was about principle, about decency, about standing up to power misused. And eventually the HOA cracked. It started with silence. The letters stopped coming. The fines, which had once arrived with the consistency of a ticking clock, simply vanished. No explanation, no apology, just gone. Then came the emergency board meeting, hastily organized and not so subtly scheduled to avoid attention. But attention is exactly what they got. Word spread fast. On the evening of the meeting, the community center was packed. Standing room only. Parents showed up with their kids. Reporters came with cameras. Survivors brought their photos and stories. Even the mayor sent a representative. What was meant to be a quiet, behind closed doors conversation turned into a full-blown reckoning. I didn't go there to gloat. I went to speak, to give voice to everything the board had tried to silence. Not just for me, but for every family who had ever been bullied into submission over a garden gnome or a mailbox color. I brought the original violation notice with me and held it up. "This," I said, "is what they called a threat to the community." I pointed to the back of the room, where a collage of photos had been pinned on the wall. Images of children laughing in the treehouse, survivors signing their names, families gathering on the grass beneath it. "And this," I continued, "is what it became." People applauded. Some cried. And when I sat down, I knew the tide had turned. The board tried to regain control. Karen stood up, visibly shaken but still clinging to the last threads of authority. She gave a speech, something about consistency, governance, and long-term planning. But her words were hollow, her voice barely carrying over the whispers of frustration and disbelief echoing through the room. She glanced at me once, quickly, nervously, and for the first time since this began, I saw it in her eyes. She knew she had lost. Then it happened. One by one, community members stepped forward. A mother whose son had played in the treehouse after his final round of chemo. A father who admitted he had once supported Karen, but had changed his mind after seeing the bigger picture. A teenage girl who left a message on the treehouse wall that simply said, "I survived too." By the time the last speaker finished, the room was no longer divided. It was unified. The vote to remove the board was swift, a full resignation. Every member, including Karen, forced to step down. No ceremony, no handshakes, just a stunned silence as the decision was announced. Karen didn't say a word as she left the room. She didn't have to. The sound of the crowd rising to their feet, applauding, not her, but the moment, said everything. Justice at last had found its voice. In the weeks that followed, the transformation was staggering. The fines were formally erased. The bylaws were rewritten, this time with real community input. And the treehouse? It was officially designated as a protected community feature, complete with a plaque that reads, "Built with love, defended with heart, a place where courage climbs." Every Saturday now, that treehouse comes to life. Children from across the state visit, many of them still in treatment. Volunteers set up activities, storytellers read books, therapy dogs curl up on the grass. It's more than a playhouse. It's a sanctuary, a place of healing, of laughter, of light. And every nail in its frame stands as a quiet defiance against a system that tried to erase something beautiful. People still stop me on the street. Some want to thank me. Others want to share their own HOA horror stories. But most just want to say how much that treehouse means, not just to the kids, but to them. Because in a world that often feels cold and rigid, it reminds them that compassion still matters, that rules without reason have no place, that sometimes one voice can make a difference. And every time I look up at that treehouse, I remember the day we finished it, my daughter's tiny hands gripping mine as we painted the final board. She turned to me and said, "Now it's perfect." She was right, but it wasn't the paint or the wood or even the ladder that made it perfect. It was everything that came after, all because one HOA board couldn't see the difference between a code violation and a monument to hope. We didn't just save a treehouse. We sparked something bigger. What started as a simple act of love between a father and daughter became a symbol for families everywhere. A stand against cold rules and broken systems. A reminder that kindness, community, and courage still matter. I thought that was the end. I thought the battle was won. But peace, it turns out, was short-lived. A week after the resignation, I found an envelope in my mailbox, thicker than the rest, stamped in red. Urgent. HOA legal action. No return address, no explanation. Just one line on the front. Pending civil litigation. Karen wasn't done. She had one last card to play, and this time, she was going all in. So, here we go again. But this time, I'm ready, and I'm not coming alone. What would you do if your HOA tried to erase something sacred? Tell me your wildest HOA stories in the comments, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Because in part 2, Karen takes me to court, and I bring a surprise witness that flips the entire case on its head.